Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 76, The Great Horde, Part 1. The Great Horde ruled a large part of what would become the Russian Empire for almost 3 centuries, making it the longest-lasting entity to emerge from the Mongol Empire. Before we continue with our story, we need to look at how the Ulus of Jochi, an appanage of the Great Mongol Ulus, became the Great Horde. Stepping back a bit to look at its organization, rules of succession, and how it eventually split away from the Mongol Empire. Unfortunately, we are at something of a disadvantage when we look at its history. You might have noticed that none of the sources we have been quoting in recent episodes, the Rus Chronicles, the Secret History of the Mongols, Giovanni, Rashid ad-Din, Western travelers like Giovanni del Plano de Carpini, are actually from the Great Horde, the name that the Ulus of Jochi took on as it became an independent empire itself. If that creates the impression that the Horde was less literate or sophisticated than the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China or the Ilkhanids in the Middle East, nothing could be further from the truth. The sad truth is that the Horde's records were lost in war and national disasters, or discarded by the Russians who did not value them. So we have nothing to compare to the official histories produced by the Yuan Chagatids or Ilkhanids. These entities emerged from the appanages of the 4 sons of Chinggis Khan and Borte. Jochi, the eldest and presumed heir through the earlier part of Chinggis Khan's career, fell out with his father and lost his place in the pecking order before the conquest of the West. Jochi's sons, led by Batu, continued the campaign in the West to claim the lands that Chinggis Khan had awarded. As we have seen, with their families, followers, and a portion of the Mongol armies that was allotted to them, they carved out a new base between the Urals, the Volga, and the Black Sea. They kept their Mongol traditions in the western steppe, but as they absorbed their new subjects and grew more independent, they also changed into something new. The Horde gained this autonomy due to the wealth and power it derived from its position, which allowed it to dominate Eurasian trade and shape the history of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. From the mid-1200s to the late 1300s, the Mongols made it safe for the first time for people to travel from the Mediterranean to China, rapidly expanding the exchange of ideas and production and creating an economic boom. This has been called the Pax Mongolica, but at the same time, as the Mongols ensured the security of trade and travellers, the descendants of Chinggis Khan were fighting each other for control of those trade routes, and often fighting with the peoples that they had conquered too. Historian Marie Favreux has recently suggested replacing the term Pax Mongolica with the Mongol Exchange, arguing that it was of similar significance to the Columbian Exchange, driving progress in botany, medicine, astronomy, measurement systems, and historiography, as well as goods. She goes as far as to suggest that without the Mongolian Exchange, the Columbian Exchange would not have happened. It was the effect of the Mongols on Eurasian cultural and economic exchange, the system and networks that they dominated, that directly inspired Europeans to look for an alternative way to the east that they could control. Remember, Columbus was from Genoa, a city with a permanent diplomatic mission to the Horde and its own colony in Crimea, and he was trying to sail to China, not looking for the Americas. And this system did not appear by accident, and was not something that the Mongols preyed on like the parasitical nomads of stereotype. They built it, cared for it, and purposely set out to develop it. They had an understanding of things like artisan production, currency, trade, crop cultivation, and transportation. The Mongol tolerance for religions and other traditional practices of their conquered peoples, which has come to be one of the aspects frequently commented on in contrast to other empires, was also a part of this. They wanted their subjects to be successful and to generate more wealth. They would impose levies, tribute, and taxes, but they did not bleed their subjects dry. They did move artisan populations around during the initial conquests, and during their campaigns they took women and conscripted conquered peoples into work crews, just like every other empire, but they did not create large-scale slavery or plantation economies. The Horde created the largest integrated market that existed before modern times, uniting the territory from the Baltic to the Black Sea, Bulgaria to Siberia, and linking it all in to Central Asia, China, the Middle East, and Europe. The Yam messenger system was used for commercial communications. The Mongols developed and expanded salt and timber production, medicinal herbs, grain cultivation, and even fish farming. Their ruling elite remained nomads, but there were settlements, towns, and cities throughout their territory where they supported artisans and merchants. Even when the Mongol Empire collapsed into several smaller empires, the Horde kept the Eurasian trade system going, continuing to adapt to new conditions as they arose. The term Horde comes from the Mongolian Orda, which denoted the Khan and his main military command. Remember, for the nomads, the empire was the people, not the land. So the Horde was something like the state or the court, but it was wherever the Khan was. So it was a word with many meanings. In various contexts, it could mean the Khan and his army, or the center of the empire, all the people ruled by a Khan, or a huge camp. When other peoples came into contact with the Mongols, especially Europeans, they found it hard to understand their organization because it was so different to a sedentary state. Travelers like Giovanni de Plin de Carpini recognized the authority of the Great Khan, but struggled to get to grips with how it was implemented, and especially the distribution of authority across the Golden Family. They took the word horde, but gave it shades of teeming crowds of people in chaos, which it's continued to have in most European languages to this day. The Persians created the word Khanate, an equivalent to their own sultanate, which has also entered most European languages. This word becomes more frequently used later as the successors to the Mongol Empire break down further into smaller states, but historians find it problematic. The Sultan was a monarch, and power in the Sultanate rested with one man. This was not true among the Mongols. Here the power was more collective. There was a leader with his own horde, but then each Ulus also had its own leader with his own horde, and within each Ulus there were also other leaders who had their own hordes. The Khan could have the final say, but major decisions were made at the Kurultai, with discussion among the elites and consultations with advisors to find a consensus. Ulus came to mean the descendants and conquered peoples of the four sons of Chinggis Khan and Borte. That's Jochi, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Tolui. The word also gets interpreted as state or empire, but again with the nomadic meaning of the people, not the sedentary one of land. So the Ulus was the descendants of Jochi, their warriors, their craftsmen, merchants, farmers, steppe peoples, and sedentary peoples, essentially everyone that they ruled taken together. In contrast, the horde was the regime, the ruler with his administration and his military. Like the Ulus, the horde was multi-ethnic, but it was dominated by Mongol and Turkic steppe clans. The clans were led by begs. With time, the begs became something close to an oligarchy, but it remained essential for the Khan to be a descendant of Jochi. It was probably inevitable that the Ulus of Jochi would go its own way instead of remaining within the great Mongol Ulus. After all, steppe empires had been fluid confederations for centuries. Chinggis Khan's decision to apportion his conquests among his sons, like so many things he did, took a steppe tradition and applied it in a slightly new and different way. As the eldest, Jochi received the portion that was furthest from the home territory, and potentially the largest in his case. He began well with the subjugation of the forest peoples. Then he played a central role in the Central Asian campaign, but this is where the problems arose. Jochi took Urgench, the capital of Khwarezm. The first problem was that the city was destroyed. As we've been discussing, contrary to their reputation for savage destruction, the Mongols actually wanted these economically valuable centres captured intact. According to the secret history, Chinggis Khan even considered that the destruction of the city made the whole campaign a failure. The second, bigger mistake was that Jochi shared the loot with his brothers, but left nothing aside for his father. This enraged Chinggis Khan, who banned his sons from his presence. After a while, his advisors persuaded him to allow them to beg for forgiveness, but Chinggis Khan took some of Jochi's territory in Central Asia and gave it to Chagatai. Jochi was demoted from heir-in-waiting to just one of the sons, and Chinggis Khan started giving them possessions in each other's territories, playing them off against each other to alleviate the concern that they might team up against him. This distribution among the Khan's sons was in line with Mongol practices. Redistribution of property was one of the major functions, maybe the primary function of Mongol government. After any campaign, the leader would distribute the loot, captured cattle and people, and responsibility for new territories. Going down the social ladder, the heads of tribes would distribute to the clans, and the clans to families, and families to individuals. In the Mongol world, the head of the family did not accumulate wealth to be distributed to their heirs after death. It was an ongoing progress of distribution throughout their lives. There were three main types of redistribution. First was the produce of their animal herding. Herds could be shared to ensure that they were as productive as possible. A portion of milk, meat, and skins were delivered to the Khan for distribution. Then there was the distribution of the spoils after a campaign. Here, a portion would be set aside for the Khan, the leaders of the campaign would receive their share, and the remainder would be distributed to the participants down through the Tumen system, from the commanders of thousands down each rank to individual warriors. The third kind was wedding gifts. When a young couple married, they would move into their own ger, the Mongol term for the felt tents we usually call yurts, which is the Turkic term. The bride would bring a dowry, and the groom would be allocated a share of his family's herd. And if the family was wealthier, some of its dependent servants as well. If this added up to enough, the young couple would form its own camp, otherwise they would stay with the man's family. Sons would receive approximately the same share each, with the eldest usually being expected to move away and form a new camp. The youngest, Tolui in Chinggis Khan's case, was called the Ochigin, the hearth-keeper. He would usually not be given separate property, but would remain with the parents until they died, and then take over their property. So this system meant that every Mongol should receive some kind of fair share, and as every successful leader was required to pass wealth down to the commoners that served him, the distribution system also reinforced the hierarchy. It was also quite flexible, as leaders could decide to reward the deserving, rather than always strictly following seniority. So the way Chinggis Khan treated his sons was in line with Mongol tradition, and would have been understood by his followers, even if it seems a little bit strange to us to be portioning out the empire to them. It went beyond tradition due to the scale of his conquests. No previous Mongol had had to deal with allocating this kind of territory to his sons. By the time he died, each of the sons controlled territory and populations greater than the whole of Mongolia had been before Chinggis Khan. Jochi, as we know, received the western steppe. Chagatai received territory in Central Asia. Ogadei received Jungaria, the northern part of what's now Xinjiang and central Mongolia, and Tolui received eastern Mongolia. These were the steppe areas that were intended to be the places where they were based and lived. They also had rights to rule neighboring sedentary areas like northern China, Khorasan and Khwarezm, the Caucasus, and Rus. Across these areas, as we've seen in Rus, Mongol officials would oversee local rulers and gather taxes for the Mongol rulers in the steppe. Although Jochi fell into disfavor, and although a couple of generations after Chinggis Khan's death, rival branches of the ruling clan became more open in their suspicions of his true parentage, as the eldest son, he was allocated the furthest portion of the steppe. This was good fortune for his heirs, provided they could conquer it, because, as you know, it had the best pasture, the most temperate climate, and the best access to the trade networks of Northern Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Islamic world. The circumstances of Jochi's death are rather unclear, as we've already heard. He was summoned to the Kurultai after Subadai had returned from the first Western campaign with mixed results, but he stayed at his camp on the Irtysh River. He was ordered to conduct a new campaign to subdue the Kipchaks, but time passed and he didn't go anywhere. He was asked to come to Mongolia to explain himself, but he said he was ill and couldn't travel. Someone brought Chinggis Khan word that he was actually out hunting, so he took Chagatai and Ogadai and set off to see him. Jochi died before his father and brothers could reach him, still only in his 30s. Rashid ad-Din writes that Chinggis Khan was stricken with grief and guilt at having believed the reports that he was out hunting. He appointed Batu as his successor in the Ulus of Jochi. Batu was not the eldest of Jochi's sons. Jochi had quite a few sons, and all by different mothers, but two had mothers from the Kongirad clan, Orda and Batu. According to tradition, it was Orda himself who proposed that Batu succeeded Jochi, but Chinggis Khan had to agree to allow it to happen. The result was the division of the Ulus of Jochi into two main hordes, east and west, Ak and Gok, which, as we've seen, was not too unusual in the steppe in any case. The reasons for the move have not been preserved. Orda seems to have been an equally capable commander. We've seen him at Ryazan, Kiev, and he commanded the army at Liegnitz. Ogadai awarded both him and Batu lands in China, suggesting that he considered them as equals. Where they differed was in their relations with the rest of the Mongols. When Batu refused to go to the Kurultai upon the death of Ogadai, Orda went. When Guyuk was elected at the Kurultai in 1246, Orda represented the Ulus of Jochi, not Batu. Meanwhile, Batu stayed in the west and built his own empire. Whatever Orda's reasons for supporting Batu as his father's heir, this was not the only such case among the Mongols, and was probably a part of avoiding conflict among brothers, as once an agreement had been reached, it would be hard to legitimately make a challenge. The idea of rule by agreement was also reflected in the traditions around succession. Although there could be horse trading for a couple of years to reach a decision on who would be the next Khan, once that decision was made, there was an expectation that the Kurultai would express the consensus. Once all the senior leaders had stated their agreement, the new Khan would make a show of refusing, offering the throne to others he would claim were better candidates. The leaders would all insist, and then the new Khan would finally accept. Rashid ad-Din describes Ogadai's enthronement, where each of his brothers rejected the throne, and the new Khan finally agreed that he would fulfill his family's wishes and accept. These rituals were important, as anyone from the Golden family could theoretically make their claim, so there were always multiple contenders in every Ulus and horde. By keeping the candidates in the open and reaching a unanimous agreement on who would succeed, the Mongols usually, but not always, avoided open conflict and civil war. The agreement between Orda and Batu held for generations. Batu and his descendants had their horde, based on the Volga and holding the west. Orda and his descendants had their horde, based on the Irtish and the Syr in the east. The descendants of each did not claim the other's assets or territories, but formed two separate groups of contenders for leadership of the Ulus of Jochi. With respect to the wider Great Mongol Horde, Batu abandoned his claim when he decided not to attend the Kurultai. He could not be considered if he did not take part in the traditions. Orda withdrew from consideration himself, but the Jochis had plenty of opportunity for empire building in their own territory. So, as you probably noticed, the four sons that Chinggis Khan allotted domains to all came from Borte, his senior wife, although he had 5 other official wives and several hundred concubines. Borte came from a clan called the Kungirad, and for subsequent generations it became a tradition, not 100% strictly observed, that contenders had to be descendants of Chinggis Khan and have a Kongirad mother. This tradition carried over into the Jochids. So Jochi had at least 8 wives who gave him around 40 sons, but only Sarkadu Khatun, his senior wife and mother of order, and Ucha Ujin, a junior wife, the mother of Batu, were Kongirads. The third son to rule the Horde, Berke, was the son of Jochi and Sultan Khatun, the daughter of Muhammad Khwarazm Shah. He had a harder time advancing his claim than his brothers had had. In addition to their domain, each of the 4 sons received a keshik, and Chinggis Khan did not stint here, giving them elite warriors and commanders. Jochi received 4,000 men, whose descendants continued to serve in the keshik of Batu, and formed the core of his horde. The keshik was organized on a 12-day cycle, named for the Eastern calendar: monkey, hen, dog, pig, mouse, etc. They were further split into 4 shifts, led by 4 shift leaders, senior keshik elders who would command the men on duty and were among the closest men to the Khan. In this way, the Khan was continually guarded and served day or night. The keshik had no fixed number and varied over time. It included everything the Khan needed: guards for his protection, divided into night guards and day guards, and their quiver bearers. They were also his elite warrior corps. Then there was his household: cooks, stewards, servants, and so on, and his administration: secretaries, accountants, translators, and advisors with special knowledge in various areas. The Night Guard were also responsible for the supply system, which might seem strange at first glance until you remember how often people seemed to get poisoned. Food was a serious security issue. Essentially, the keshik formed the Khan's government. The Khans grew up around them. They were known and trusted. A likely heir would begin to recruit the core of his own keshik from his teenage years, and they would engage in your usual male bonding activities like hunting, wrestling, and other activities. When the Khan died, most of his keshik would transfer to the heir, but the Night Guard would remain a kind of guard of honor for the old Khan's chief widow, and perform various rituals to maintain the memory and prestige of their master. Senior positions in the keshik were valuable and prestigious offices that were hereditable, and their holders made efforts to ensure the succession, although the Khan's approval was required. If sent on a faraway or dangerous mission, and officials travelled the length of the empire from the Volga to Korea, they could delegate a son to act in their place. The elders of the keshik were the chief aristocracy of the horde, or the Karachu, along with the begs, who were the leaders of the subordinated peoples, holding important administrative and military positions. The Jochids also took hostages, the children of subjugated leaders. They were not held for life, but they were trained to be loyal to the Mongols. Sons might even serve in the keshik. Giovanni de Plin de Carpini met one such hostage when he visited the horde. Alexander Nevsky, the young Alexander Nevsky, who served in the Keshik and became friends with Batu's son Sartak. Right down to the eventual disintegration of the Horde, most of the Karachu still claimed descent from the original warriors that Chinggis Khan had assigned to Jochi, but they could never rise further. Despite their closeness, there was a strict line between the Golden family and the Keshik. They did not intermarry. No ethnic enclaves were allowed to form among the Kipchaks, Alans, Rus, or anyone else who was recruited to the Keshik. The Horde also had its own Kurultais, which were held on the Lunar New Year and in the middle of the year. Unlike most aspects of the Khan's court, the Kurultai was strictly for Mongols. No outsiders were permitted to attend, and we do not have any contemporary descriptions of how they functioned, although reports say that they dealt with legal cases, important marriages and appointments, diplomacy, and, of course, war. Despite the construction of Sarai and other cities in the steppe, the Khan and his horde remained truly nomadic. Actually, they were forced to by the size of their herds in order to avoid overgrazing. If we take just horses alone, the Mongols at this time owned half the global population. The size of both herds and human followers was greater than any previous steppe empire, and was another thing that required serious administrative efforts by the Jochids to support. Batu introduced rules to increase the number of smaller camps and spread the population wider to avoid straining the environment, and also created fairs and festivals so that these people, after they'd been spread out, had reasons to come together. Officials from the Keshik would supervise and move people on if they thought an area was at risk. In the milking season, mothers and young remained in one place for several months. Male herds could be moved elsewhere for meat production. The milk was fermented and the meat was dried, and Batu's share of each was collected and distributed. While the people moved to the seasons and as the herds required, Batu went where politics required it, and built supply systems that enabled him to be wherever he needed to be, whenever he needed to be there. The Khan also dispensed his wealth to merchants. It was a tradition for the Khan to overpay as a statement of wealth and power, and to encourage merchants to trade with the Mongols more widely. The Great Khan, Ogedei, had ordered that merchants selling to him be paid a 10% premium, stating that he wished no one to make a loss on trading with the Mongols. Merchants were outside of the Khan's control, so they had to attract them with favorable conditions. But even at the time, it was known that the Mongols accumulated wealth in order to distribute it, not to hoard, something that caught the attention of Western and Muslim writers alike. When questioned, Ogedei asked why he would pay someone to guard gold and silver. Instead, he handed them out to people to use, confident the return would bring more wealth. One part of this approach was the status of the Khan. The Khans were sacred and above the mundane human world. Therefore, while he had everything he needed supplied and more, his true wealth was demonstrated by distribution to the people, which was his spiritual as well as financial function. As Favoraux comments, quote, "Wealth only made sense in terms of its redistribution, which was carried out according to the Kubi, a system of shares based on the Tumen. The Khan gave gifts, many obtained via trade and diplomacy, to the heads of thousands, and so on down the line." End quote. The luxury goods that the Mongols traded for were not needed for subsistence. They were part of this political economy, used for rewards and maintaining loyalty, a reflection of the Mongol collectivist worldview. Batu overpaid merchants even more than the Great Khan. He wanted to be independent, and that meant competing, and he was starting from a weaker position. But within a few years he had made his territory the major Mongol trade hub. No other Chinggisids were allowed to claim a share. When one of the Chagatids did try, Batu had him executed. Batu had Sarai built around 1250, essentially in the middle of his realm, going from north to south, which was the usual pattern the nomads moved in. It had buildings. It was not a camp. There were brick buildings and statues, but it was not a classical city. A huge palace modelled on a tent stood in the centre, which was for ceremonial and official use, but not a residence. It did not have buildings intended to impress with their magnificence or royal mausoleums. Rather frustratingly, we do not have a proper description at all. William of Rubric visited in late 1254, but wrote only that he'd been to Batu's new city, where the Khan had a palace on the eastern bank. We can assume that it was something like Karakoram, which had districts for merchants and craftsmen, Buddhist temples, churches, and mosques. Like Karakoram, it would have been a meeting point for subjugated rulers to come and see the Khan, administrators, artisans, and merchants. It was not the only such city in the Horde. Several towns were created as bases for captured artisans who had been moved from elsewhere. Residences were built for diplomatic missions who were unused to the nomadic lifestyle and foreign visitors such as Catholic monks. Merchants also had bases with warehousing. As we'll look into in more detail in the next episode, towns were springing up across the steppe. Their size could ebb and flow as nomads came and went, including the Khan and his entourage, but there was a permanent population too. The Mongols understood the value of towns and cities for their subjects, major gatherings, religions, and industrial centres, but for themselves, they continued to prefer their tents. Batu's horde could reach as many as 100,000 people. Moving was a serious operation, and another reason for the Mongols' incredible discipline. Everyone knew their place in the mobile mass and their place to camp. But there were also other large hordes within the Great Horde. Orda, as we've already mentioned, who lived on the Irtish. Sartak, Batu's son and expected heir, had his horde. Batu's sister and her husband had a horde based by the Don. Batu's brother Berke had his horde in Transcaucasia. Several high-ranking commanders had hordes on the Dnieper and on each side of the Ural Mountains, and Jochi's senior widow had his former night guard and her horde back in the east by Lake Alakol. Each of them would follow a seasonal circuit of several hundred kilometers to ensure the health of their herds. Batu and Sartak were always close to each other. The others could be hundreds of kilometers apart, but remained in close contact through the Yam system, which quickly carried communications everywhere in the empire. There were hundreds of Yam stations. Local people were required to maintain them with everything they needed. Horses were designated as pack or postal mounts. Important routes kept specially selected fast mounts for urgent messages. The Morin Yam was the postal service, mounted riders only, and covered the whole empire. The Turgenyam included carts and camels for carrying goods, and had specific circuits. The Narinyam was the secret intelligence network. Messengers could cover 200 kilometers a day. The whole system was one of the keys to the Mongols being capable of running their empires. Batu died in 1255, at around 50 years old, having spent more than a decade ruling the Western Steppe. Because of Jochi's early death, he had become leader of his Ulus while still young, and when the other grandsons of Chinggis Khan took over their Ulus, he was the oldest and most experienced. Despite his independent tendencies, his authority was never questioned, and he was accepted as second only to the Great Khan. Batu chose his son Sartak as his successor. We know little about Sartak. He may have been Anda, a kind of Mongolian blood brother with Alexander Nevsky. He ruled only a matter of months before dying on the way back from visiting the Great Khan Monkey in Karakorum. It's likely that he was poisoned by Berke. Monkey appointed Ulagche as the next Khan. We know even less about him than about Sartak, and his reign was even shorter. There's some confusion over whether he was a younger son of Batu or the son of Sartak. He was succeeded by Berke. Berke was in his 40s, a respected commander, and descended from Chinggis Khan, but not a Mongol mother. He was not appointed by the Great Khan. He was another step towards the independence of the Horde. Batu had never openly broken with the Great Khan and the other Uluses. He steered a line between acknowledging the hierarchy and doing whatever he wanted to do. Batu and Orda had supported the rise of the Toluids after the death of Guyuk, which probably also brought them some leeway with their independence. By the 1250s, the Toluids had secured their claim to the throne of the Great Khan, pushing out the other two branches of the family. The Jochids had already withdrawn when Batu did not travel to the Kurultai. The Jochids were starting to look like a Western rival to the Great Khan in the east, and Berke was willing to take his opposition into the open. The Mongol Empire was still growing, with campaigns in China, Persia, and the Middle East. But the Jochids had turned away from expansionism to developing what they already had in the Western Steppe. And this is where the disagreement arose. The Jochids were not concerned by expansion in the east. That benefited the Toluids without affecting them. The west was a different matter. Expansion here threatened Jochid control of the trade networks and brought rivals up to its borders. Monkey sent his brother Hulagu to conquer Persia, Iraq, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Anatolia, and Egypt. And there was another bone of contention. Berke, as I mentioned, was the son of a daughter of the last Shah of Khwarezm. His mother had raised him as a Muslim. Although Berke joined the campaign, it appears that he opposed the sack of Baghdad and the execution of the Caliph by Hulagu. But as long as Monkey remained Khan, Berke fulfilled his obligations as the senior Jochid. After several years of successful campaigning, the Mamluk Sultanate in Cairo stood alone against the Mongol onslaught. But then, in 1260, the Mamluk emir Baybars defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut, near Jerusalem. Hulagu declared that he would not rest until the Mamluks were destroyed. Meanwhile, Monkey had died. There was no clear heir. Two of Monkey's brothers, Kubilai and Arikboke, both claimed the throne, each calling their own Kurultai. Berke took Arikboke's side. Hulagu backed Kubilai. With Kubilai's support, Hulagu started taking Jochid territory and revenue in Central Asia and Iran. Berke ordered his commander, Neguda, to remove Hulagu's men from Herat and ensure that the Jochids received their due. In response, Hulagu began purging Jochids from his troops. He arrested a grandson of Jochi, Tuta, with whom he had already had arguments, accused him of treachery and executed him. Now it was a blood feud, one that Tuta's son, Nogai, one of the greatest Mongol generals, the descendants of whose followers still bear his name, would never forgive. Hulagu continued purging any non-Toluid from positions of authority across Central Asia and the Caucasus. In Azerbaijan, Jebe's kinsman Baiju, who had commanded the conquest of the Seljuk Sultanate, ruled while serving neither the Jochids nor the Toluids. Hulagu attacked him and had him poisoned. The Mongols were now conquering each other. By the end of 1261, Berke had decided that he had to fight back. The Jochid forces quickly retook their former North Caucasian territory, the Caspian coast, Derbent and Tabriz. But when Hulagu arrived with his full army, he pushed them back all the way to the Terek River. Berke was in trouble. The Jochids had lost their possessions and rights in the Caucasus, Khorasan, the Seljuk Sultanate, and Baghdad. The Jochids still held northern Khwarezm, with Chagatai's grandson Algu, another supporter of Arikboke, holding the south. But, as Berke was fighting Hulagu in the Caucasus, Algu changed sides to Kubilai. He attacked Jochid territory in Khwarezm and took control of Bukhara and Samarkand. This was the final straw for Arikboke, who surrendered to Kubilai. Hulagu cancelled the Jochid share to taxes from cities in his control. Jochid troops under his command fled to join Neguda in Afghanistan, and fighting would continue for several decades. It was not about territory. Hulagu was cutting and redirecting the trade routes. The Eurasian trade network and the whole system of wealth distribution that the Horde was built on was under threat. Join me next episode as the Horde loses its war with the Toluids, but gains its independence. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.